In a forgotten village where time seemed to stand still, a silent epidemic had taken root. The men, once proud and strong, had fallen prey to the numbing grip of mirror and alcohol. Days turned into blood nights, and with each passing season, the men lost more than just their strength, they lost their ability to be husbands, to be fathers. The village was fading, its future hanging by a fragile thread, and the women, left in the shadows of their husbands' addictions, had reached their breaking point. This village would disappear if nothing changes, one woman whispered, her voice trembling as the others gathered around her, faces etched with worry and frustration. Their husbands could no longer bear children, their bodies weakened by years of abuse. And with each passing day, the possibility of a new generation slipped further out of reach. But in the midst of their despair, a name echoed through the whispers of these broken wives, a name that might just hold the key to their salvation. Kejona, he's different, another voice spoke up. He's a God-fearing man, untouched by the poison the others drown in. Eyes turned toward one another, the seed of a wild, daring idea taking root in their minds. What if Kejona, the only man in the village still strong, still pure, could be the one to save them? The thought sent a ripple through the women, and before the day was out, 3 elders had set off to approach his mother with a request that would either save the village or tear it apart. The women of the village had suffered in silence for far too long. Every afternoon, they gathered under the shade of a massive baobab tree, speaking in hushed voices about their unfulfilled lives, their inability to bear children, and the growing void between them and their husbands. There was anger, there was sorrow, but above all, there was fear, the fear that their village would soon be barren, their future lost to addiction and despair. It was during one of these gatherings that the idea was first spoken aloud. Kejona is different, an older woman muttered, her words hanging in the air like a challenge. He doesn't use mirror, doesn't drink. He prays, he walks, he's still strong. The other women leaned in closer, their curiosity piqued. They knew Kejona well. He was a quiet, God-fearing man, respected for his righteousness and his refusal to fall into the same habits as the other men in the village. While the rest wasted away, Kejona remained steadfast, seemingly untouched by the village's slow decay. What if he's the answer? Another woman suggested, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and desperation. What if he can still father children? What if he's the only one who can save us? The idea seemed scandalous, but desperation had clouded their judgment. They needed to act. After much discussion, it was decided, the elders would visit Kejona's family and ask for his help. It was the only hope they had left. The next morning, 3 elder women set out on their mission. They arrived at Kejona's parents' home, their faces set in determination. Kejona's mother, a wise and kind woman, greeted them warmly, though she could sense something unusual in their presence. After sitting down, the women spoke openly about the village's struggles. They shared their worries, their heartache over the men's lost strength, and the fear that no more children would be born. Finally, they came to the point of their visit. Kejona. We believe your son, Kejona, is the only man left in the village who can still bring life into this world, one of the elders said, her voice trembling with emotion. We need him to help our women. To save us. Kejona's mother, though shocked by the request, understood the gravity of the situation. Her heart ached for her village and for the women who had endured so much. After a long moment of silence, she nodded. If Kejona can help, I will speak to him, she said. That evening, Kejona's mother called him into their home, her face serious. Kejona could sense that something was deeply troubling her, and when she finally spoke, her words left him stunned. The village elders came today, she began, choosing her words carefully. They believe you are the only man left who is still capable of fathering children. They want you to help save the village by giving one of their women a child. Kejona's eyes widened in disbelief. He had always lived a righteous, simple life, avoiding the vices that had claimed the other men. But this was something he had never imagined. "Mother, what are you asking of me?" he asked, his voice filled with confusion. "I'm not asking you," his mother replied gently. "But the village is. They are desperate, Kejona. They believe you are the only one who can save them." Kejona sat in silence for a long time, grappling with the enormity of what was being asked of him. He was a man of faith, a man who believed in doing what was right. And if the village's future truly depended on him, how could he turn his back on them? Finally, he nodded. "If this is what is needed to save the village, I will do it." The next morning, the 3 elder women returned to Kejona's home, their faces a mixture of hope and anticipation. When Kejona agreed to their request, the relief in their eyes was palpable. "We will bring you a woman, someone who is ready to see if you can help," one of the elders said. "If you are truly fertile, you could save the village from extinction." Kejona's heart pounded as he listened to their words, but he knew there was no turning back now. The fate of the village rested on his shoulders, and he had agreed to bear that weight. The elder women left with promises to return soon with a woman who would test Kejona's strength and fertility. And as Kejona watched them disappear down the road, he couldn't shake the feeling that the fate of the entire village now rested in his hands. The days that followed were tense, the air thick with anticipation. The village women whispered to one another, their eyes constantly on the road, waiting for the return of the elders with the woman who would change their fate. Every day seemed to stretch longer than the last, and Kejona could feel the weight of expectation growing heavier on his shoulders. Finally, one late afternoon, the 3 elder women returned. Walking beside them was a young woman, her head bowed and her steps uncertain. She had been chosen from among the villagers, deemed ready for the test. The elders brought her to Kejona's home without a word, her presence alone enough to send a ripple through the waiting village. Kejona stood in the doorway of his home, watching them approach, his heart pounding in his chest. He had agreed to this, but now, standing face to face with the reality of what was to come, fear and doubt clawed at his resolve. The village elders spoke no words of comfort as they ushered him inside, the woman following silently behind. The small, dimly lit room felt suffocating. Kejona's mother remained outside, her face turned away, unable to witness the scene unfolding within. As they closed the door behind them, the eldest woman stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Kejona, you know what is expected of you," she said, looking between him and the woman. "Tonight, you will lie with this woman. It is your duty to the village. We need proof, Kejona, that you are still fertile." Kejona's throat tightened, but he nodded in silence. The elder woman then placed a folded white sheet on the bed between them. "This sheet will be the sign," she continued, her voice heavy with the weight of the task ahead. "In the morning, we will return. If there is blood on this sheet, it will prove that you are still strong, that you are fertile. You must not fail, Kejona. The village is counting on you." The instructions hung in the air like a final command, leaving no room for argument. Kejona glanced at the woman beside him. She still hadn't spoken a word, her eyes locked on the floor. He could feel her fear as much as his own. When the elders left, closing the door with a quiet click, Kejona stood in the dim room, his hands trembling. The white sheet lay on the bed like an accusation. This was his responsibility, and failure was not an option. Yet, he felt as though he was standing on the edge of a cliff, ready to fall into an unknown abyss. The night dragged on, heavy with silence. Kejona lay beside the woman, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. He could hear the faint sounds of the village outside, muffled voices, the occasional bark of a dog, but in this room, time seemed to have stopped. Finally, morning broke, and with it came the dreaded knock on the door. The village women had returned, their faces filled with expectation. "Kejona, "Come out," one of the elders called, her voice loud enough to reach the ears of those gathered outside. The moment had come. Kejona's heart pounded as he stood, his legs feeling like lead. He looked back at the white sheet on the bed, stained as expected. But instead of relief, all he felt was a deep, unshakable shame. The village women were waiting for him, and he could hear their murmurs of excitement. They had gathered outside in growing numbers, eager to see the proof that Kejona had succeeded where all the other men had failed. Kejona hesitated at the door, fear and humiliation swirling inside him. But he couldn't delay any longer. With a deep breath, he stepped outside, clutching the white sheet in his trembling hands. The crowd fell silent as he emerged, all eyes locked on the cloth he held. The elder women stepped forward, their faces etched with a mix of hope and anxiety. Kejona's hands shook as he unfolded the sheet, revealing the unmistakable stains. Blood. A wave of relief swept through the crowd. Murmurs of approval and excitement rose among the women, and soon, they were smiling, nodding to one another. The elder women stepped forward and touched Kejona's arm. "You have saved us," one of them whispered. "You are still fertile, Kejona. You are unlike the others." The women turned to the gathering crowd, holding up the sheet as though it were a banner of hope. "He is still strong," they called out, their voices filled with triumph. "He is still fertile. Our village has hope again." The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices filled with joy and gratitude. Kejona, though still filled with a deep sense of shame, stood silently as the women gathered around him, thanking him for what he had done. "You are the village's hope," they said, bowing their heads in gratitude. "You are the only one who can help us bring life back to this place." Despite the praise and thanks, Kejona felt a heavy weight on his soul. He had done what was asked of him, but the reality of it all gnawed at him, refusing to let him feel proud of his actions. He had saved the village, yes, but at what cost to his own heart and soul? As the village women celebrated, Kejona quietly withdrew from the crowd, his heart heavy with conflicting emotions. Word of Kejona's success spread like wildfire through the village. For the women who had suffered for years, unable to bear children due to their husbands' infertility, this news felt like a miracle. Whispers turned into plans, and soon, a movement among the women began to take shape. As evening approached, something unusual stirred in the village. Women, young and old, some already mothers but longing for more children, others desperate for their first, began gathering in small groups outside their homes. Each of them carried their bedding, mats, blankets, and pillows in their arms, and their faces were determined, filled with an unspoken resolve. The men of the village, already weakened from years of chewing marrow and drowning their sorrows in alcohol, barely noticed the stirring at first. But as the numbers of women leaving their homes swelled, some of the men began to take notice. "Where are you going with your bedding?" one man asked his wife, seeing her walk out with a bundle in her arms. His wife, face unflinching and resolute, turned to him and answered, "We are going to Kejona's home. He is the only man left in this village who can give us children. We've decided to assemble there tonight because he is still fertile, and he is the only one who can help us." The man was too stunned to respond, and the same scene played out in household after household. Women across the village were all heading in the same direction, leaving their bewildered husbands behind. At Kejona's home, the gathering grew larger with every passing hour. The elder women had taken charge, directing the assembly of beddings throughout the yard and inside the house. The scene was surreal, women laying their beds in neat rows, while the village's men watched helplessly from a distance, too ashamed and weakened by their own failings to intervene. Inside Kejona's modest home, the elder women were busy organizing the group, their hands moving swiftly as they set out food and drink. They spoke in hushed tones, discussing how things would proceed once Kejona arrived. "Each of these women has come here with hope," one of the elder women said, her voice filled with purpose. They all believe Kejona can give them what their husbands no longer can, children. We will ensure this is done in an orderly fashion. Kejona will see that he must fulfill his duty. As night fell, Kejona returned home from a day spent working in the fields. He was exhausted, his body aching, but when he approached his home, something seemed strange. The usual quietness of the evening was replaced by the sound of voices, many voices, and the flickering of lamps through the windows. Confused, Kejona quickened his pace, only to stop dead in his tracks as he neared his house. His yard, his home, was filled with women. There were dozens of them, some standing, some sitting, and many already lying down on their beddings. What is this? Kejona whispered to himself, his heart racing. Before he could process the scene, one of the elder women saw him and approached, her face calm and serious. Kejona, you have returned. We have been waiting for you. Kejona looked around, his confusion deepening. Why are all these women here? He asked, his voice shaky. The elder woman placed a hand on his shoulder. They have come to you, Kejona, because you are their last hope. Their husbands can no longer father children, and the women of this village have suffered for too long. You are the only man left who is fertile. It is your duty to help them, to give them the children they so desperately long for. Kejona took a step back, overwhelmed. But how can I? The elder woman's eyes were firm but kind. It is not a choice, Kejona. It is a necessity. These women have come with faith, believing that you can restore life to this village. You must not let them down. Before he could respond, another elder woman joined them, nodding in agreement. We have organized everything. The women will wait their turn. You must do this for the village, Kejona. Kejona stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to comprehend the enormity of what was being asked of him. He had never imagined anything like this. His entire life had been ordinary, simple, even. Now, suddenly, the hopes of an entire village rested on his shoulders, and the responsibility was too much to bear. As the elders guided him inside the house, the women looked on with quiet anticipation, whispering amongst themselves. Each of them believed that tonight could be the night that would change their lives, that Kejona would be the man to give them the children they had longed for. The night was closing in, and the pressure on Kejona grew with every passing minute. The elder women continued to instruct him, their voices steady but insistent. You will spend the night with these women, they said. And by morning, we will know if you have fulfilled your duty. Kejona swallowed hard, the weight of the village's future pressing down on him. As the last rays of the sun disappeared, the night stretched ahead like an endless test of his strength and resolve. The night passed, and Kejona, overwhelmed by the weight of his task, served the women as instructed by the elder women. One by one, they entered his room, following the line the elders had carefully arranged. Kejona, though nervous and unsure, fulfilled the role they had forced upon him. The women came with faith, and each one left believing that their hopes for children would soon be realized. Days turned into weeks, and the village settled back into its normal routine, though now, there was a sense of anticipation in the air. The women who had visited Kejona's home would occasionally glance at each other, wondering when they would start to see the signs. They had followed the line, and now they waited for the miracle they believed was coming. 3 months later, something remarkable began to happen. One morning, one of the women started spitting silver, a sure sign in the village that she was pregnant. Word spread quickly, and soon, more women began experiencing the same symptoms. There was no doubt now, Kejona had done what no other man in the village could do. The women were pregnant. The village was buzzing with excitement. Women gathered in small groups, chatting joyfully about their pregnancies, their faces glowing with happiness. Some rubbed their growing bellies with pride, knowing that soon, they would become mothers. For years, they had suffered in silence, unable to bear children because of their husbands' infertility. But now, their prayers had been answered. Their husbands, on the other hand, were filled with shame. The men, once proud and boastful, now hung their heads in defeat. They had failed their wives, failed their families, and failed the village. Every time they saw the women smiling and rubbing their bellies, a wave of guilt washed over them, knowing that it was Kejona who had succeeded where they could not. As the months passed, the pregnant women began visiting the hospital for their checkups. Nurses and doctors marveled at the sudden influx of expectant mothers from the village. It was as though a miracle had happened overnight, and no one could quite explain how or why. Kejona, meanwhile, continued to live his life quietly. He had done what was asked of him, but he never sought attention or praise for it. He kept to himself, knowing that the village's future was no longer in jeopardy. By the time 9 months had passed, the village was transformed. Women started going into labor, and soon, the sounds of newborn cries filled the air. One by one, they gave birth, some to boys, others to girls. The village, once silent and somber, was now alive with the laughter and joy of new life. Women who had long been barren held their babies in their arms, tears streaming down their faces. The years of suffering were finally over. They looked at their children with love and gratitude, knowing that Kejona had saved them from a future of despair. As the women gathered with their newborns, the husbands stood to the side, still unable to face the truth. They were grateful for the children, but the knowledge that they could not give them to their wives was a burden they would carry for the rest of their lives. And so, the village, once plagued by infertility and hopelessness, was reborn. Kejona had done what no one thought possible, and because of him, the village was filled with the sounds of new life, babies crying, mothers laughing, and a future that was finally bright once again. The elder women, who had orchestrated everything, looked on with satisfaction. They had done what they needed to save their community, and now, their efforts had borne fruit.